Hello, everyone, and welcome to Book Breaks. We're so thrilled today to welcome Jonathan Eig and his book, King a Life. And we'd like to thank Citizen Travelers, the nonpartisan civic engagement initiative of the Travelers Companies, for their support of Book Breaks. And as always, I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm joined by my friend Ryan, who will be moderating your questions in the second half of the program. And without further ado, we're so thrilled to welcome Jonathan, who is a former senior writer for the Wall Street Journal. He's a New York Times bestselling author of several books, including Ali, A Life, Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season. Ken Bergens calls him a master storyteller, and his books have been listed among the best of the year by the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, Sports Illustrated, and Slate. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Now, I was wondering, just starting off, if you can give us an overview of King.
Wow, that might take a while, but I'll try.
Okay, well, yes, the Reader's Digest beginning overview.
Well, this is an attempt to tell King's story a little bit more intimately than it's been told in the past. There have been many wonderful books about King and the civil rights movement, but the books that I think most people think of when they think of big King biographies are the Taylor Branch trilogy and the David Garrow book, Bearing the Cross. And those books are really centered on the civil rights movement with King as a leading character. I wanted to write a book that was focused on King with the civil rights movement secondarily, so that you might experience his journey a little bit more personally, a little more closely. And the reason for that is that in the years since Garrow's book and Branch's books have come out, we've seen King turned into a national holiday and a monument on the Mall in Washington, things that he richly deserves. But in the process, we have lost sight of his humanity. We've lost sight of even some of what he stood for. We've turned him into a very safe figure in many ways. We've watered down his message. And I wanted to remind people just how radical, how religious, how brave he was. And frankly, I wanted to make you cry for what we lost when we lost this man at the age of 39. So that's really how I approached telling the story.
Absolutely. And you start off by really going in depth about Michael King, Martin's father. Can you tell us what you uncovered about him in your research?
I was fortunate to find a lot of new archival material in this book. I mean, I had access to hundreds of people who knew King, which is, astonishing really to think about how many people are still out there who knew King. But among the archival documents that I discovered was a brand new, unpublished, never really seen autobiography of Martin Luther King Sr., who, as you hinted, was born Michael King and didn't change his name until he was in his 30s. To Martin Luther King. And one of the astonishing things about Martin Luther King Sr. is to realize that he was born a sharecropper. He was sharecropping until he was 12, 13 years old, and decided that the only way to really improve his lot was to leave, to literally walk off the farm with his only pair of shoes slung over his shoulders, tied together, and make his way to Atlanta, 20 miles from Stockbridge, where the family was farming. And I think Martin Luther King Sr. is one of America's great stories, a story that should be told in opera or something, because he really envisions a future. And so much of it comes from the Bible, because the Bible tells him that this is what we should be doing in the future, that we should make real the promise that all men are created equal. The Bible tells us that the Constitution isn't living up to its words, and that it's going to be incumbent on the Black people in America to help deliver that promise. And Martin Luther King Sr. believes that and makes his way to Atlanta, teaches himself to read and write, becomes a pastor, marries a pastor's daughter, and paves the way for Martin Luther King Jr. There is no Martin Luther King Jr. literally without Martin Luther King Sr. changing his name and making it possible for his son to do what he does.
Yeah. And what about his mother? What was her influence?
Alberta Williams King was this tiny little, quiet, very quiet woman, but she was a powerhouse. And she was really, you see so much, sometimes, with a kid, you can see almost as if they're two equal halves. You can see the fiery side that comes from Martin Luther King Sr., and you can see the loving kindness that comes from his mother, Alberta, who's a warm, wonderful, bubbly, funny person. And, we often don't see that side of Martin Luther King Jr. because he always has to put on this very serious face when he's in public. But he was a delight to be around. He cracked people up with his sense of humor and his just love for other people. He could never say no to people. He was genuinely interested in other people's stories. That warmth comes from his mother. And women play a very important role, not just in MLK's upbringing, but his whole life. And it's something that we haven't focused on enough.
Yeah, and there's so many amazing stories in here, but one early on is his connection, Martin Luther King's connection to Gone with the Wind. Can you tell us about that? Because that was fascinating.
Oh my God. Yeah, I could have written like a whole little book on this scene. So Martin Luther King is born in 1929. 10 years later, the biggest movie in Hollywood history opens, Gone with the Wind, based on this giant best-selling book. And they decide to premiere it in Atlanta. And this is a huge deal. It's maybe the biggest thing to happen in Atlanta, certainly in generations. The entire town is rolling out the red carpet for Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh and all these other stars who fly in for the Hollywood premiere. And they decide to do a giant gala, and they build a mansion that's supposed to look like the plantation house in the movie.
Era.
Right. And people dress in period costumes. For months, men are growing out their mustaches and beards to prepare for this. It's a giant event. And Black people are not invited, of course, and they're not invited to the Hollywood premiere, but they are asked to serve as waiters and waitresses for the gala. And they are asked some of the churches are invited to dress in the clothes of enslaved people and to perform for the white guests. And much of Black Atlanta is horrified by this invitation. And especially a lot of Black Baptist churches are horrified by this, because not only is it celebrating slavery, but you're asking us to perform at a party where there's dancing and things that Baptists are not generally endorsing. But Martin Luther King Sr. just accepts the invitation and sends his church choir dressed in slave clothes to perform. And young Martin Luther King, age 10, is sitting in the first row singing along with these songs of enslavement, songs of. It's just mind-boggling to think that our greatest freedom fighter, one of our greatest fighters for justice, is performing in this capacity. But it just goes to show you that it was a complicated time and place in which he grew up.
Absolutely. And another fascinating story you tell early on in the book is the sort of misconception that grew out of MLK's relationship with Malcolm X based on Alex Haley's interview. Can you tell us about that?
Malcolm X and Martin Luther King had a very complicated relationship all of their careers. And mostly, Martin Luther King tended to be pretty open-minded. When people disagreed with him, when people called him out, he recognized that they were doing it for posturing purposes, that he was the big name, he was the big figure, and they could gain by challenging him. Malcolm X would position himself as the more radical alternative, knowing that that would attract crowds. And Martin Luther King got that. When Stokely Carmichael said to him, I'm using you, Martin just laughed and said, of course I know that. I've been used before. I don't mind. You do your thing, I'll do mine. But he respected them, and he respected Malcolm X too. And they only met once, unfortunately. But sadly, when Alex Haley interviewed Martin Luther King for Playboy magazine, it was the longest interview ever published for Martin Luther King. He was asked what he thought of Malcolm X, and Haley made up quotes. And I discovered this by going through Alex Haley's archives and looking for the original transcripts of his interviews with Martin Luther King. And I saw that he had dramatically changed large portions of that interview, but he had completely made up a quote about his thoughts on Malcolm X. And I think Haley or his editors were just trying to do it to fan the flames, to create controversy. And Martin Luther King never complained about it. But when asked about what he thought of Malcolm, King was quoted saying, I think his fiery demagogic oratory is a disaster. But what he actually said was that, I don't think I have all the answers. I'm open to listening and learning from people. So it's a very important correction that we need to make, because that has been repeated and taught in college classrooms for decades. And we tend to think of Martin Luther King as being critical of Malcolm X. And he was certainly critical of anybody who called for violence, but he was not critical in the larger sense about what he thought about Malcolm. I think they were both really, they were brothers in the fight for Black dignity.
Yeah. And how did recently declassified FBI files impact your work?
Well, there were thousands and thousands of pages of new documents. And as we know, the FBI began recording King's colleagues and then actually recording his own King's phone calls as well. His home and his office phones were tapped. And those documents were released in a big chunk in the 1970s. But then the last few years, under an order from Donald Trump, thousands of more pages were released. And very few people have bothered to look at them. And in fact, I don't think Trump actually knew that he had released them, because he meant to release some JFK papers, and the King stuff was included, to my good fortune. But what we have as a result of that are thousands of pages of new transcripts of King's phone calls. And it's important that we recognize that while these calls do reveal some of King's human flaws, that they do reveal his relationships with women other than his wife, they're most important because they reveal just how aggressively the FBI was out to destroy King. And we can hear that he's clearly not engaged in communist activity. We can hear that his flirtation with women is not a matter of national security. But what we learn is that the FBI used those flirtations to try to destroy King's reputation, to break up his marriage, and to taint his reputation with the press and even with the president. And LBJ knew exactly what was going on and was complicit, entirely complicit, actually seemed to be enjoying the gossip that he shared with J. Edgar Hoover about King's personal life.
Yeah, and what was behind Hoover's sort of fascination with King?
A number of things. Racism, high on the list. I think it's safe to say, and there's a terrific new book by Lerone Martin that makes the case that J. Edgar Hoover is a white Christian nationalist, and that the FBI was engaged in trying to maintain white Christian nationalism, that they saw King as a threat because he posed a threat to the status quo. And that the idea of sharing power with a group that had been denied power for so long was unappealing. Why should we give up what we've got? It's working pretty well for us. I think that's the way J. Edgar Hoover viewed it. At the same time, race definitely plays a factor. He was suspicious of Black people, saw them as a threat, and maybe just saw them as inferior to some extent too. His nickname for King was that burrhead.
Wow. And what about the Kennedy family? What was his relationship like with the Kennedys?
I keep saying that these relationships were complicated, and that's because they were. The Kennedy family authorized the wiretaps on King at the same time that they were negotiating with him to try to bring about the Civil Rights Act. And Kennedy was elected to office largely thanks to Black voters who at the last minute really came out in great support for him. And King thought that he owed the Black community something, and that he was acting very slowly and reluctantly to fulfill that promise, that he was much more concerned about losing votes in the South than he was about justice, that he seemed to genuinely care about the rights of Black people. He seemed to genuinely care about fighting Jim Crow, but he was hesitant to take the political risk until King held his feet to the fire. And I think King was constantly frustrated by Kennedy's reluctance. And some of it is a misunderstanding. King is a religious man. He's not a politician. He doesn't understand why Kennedy wouldn't just do what he believes. And Kennedy must have thought King was a little naive, that you don't understand that I'm a politician and I have to worry about getting reelected. So there was a communication gap there, I think. And the same thing goes for LBJ and King. They don't understand each other because they don't really understand where one another is coming from.
Yeah, and something that's so different than now is the way the media ignored even the existence of these tapes or what was on it. Why was that?
That's a great question. J. Edgar Hoover and LBJ himself said, why aren't we leaking these King tapes to the media? He wanted to see King's reputation damaged because he was so angry about King's criticism of the Vietnam War. But the white media, certainly the Black media too, but they weren't leaking it to the Black media, they were leaking it to the white media. And big mainstream newspapers and TV stations were getting copies of the transcripts of King's conversations with women. In some cases, they were given access to the tapes, and they did not print those stories. And that's because, in general, the standard of the day was that we don't invade people's privacy. They would have to, I think the feeling was, if we wrote about King's sex life, we'd have to write about our local mayor's sex life, and our senator's sex life, and our president's sex life, and Mickey Mantle's sex life. And not to pick on Mickey Mantle, but that was the standard of the day, that, the newspaper reporters and TV reporters were in a kind of a pact that this stuff wasn't made public. Now, to me, the big question is, so yes, kudos to them for not printing the story that King was having affairs, but why didn't they recognize the bigger story? Why didn't they recognize that the real news here is that our federal government and our nation's leading law enforcement agency is surveilling a private citizen and obsessed with his sex life? Why should that be a matter of national security? That's the story that they should have written, and none of them did.
Yeah, absolutely. And a very powerful moment in the book is when you write about King's reaction to winning the Nobel Prize. Can you tell us about that? Because that was pretty unexpected, his reaction.
Well, first of all, it's important to note that he was in the hospital when he got the news. He was exhausted. He was often hospitalized for what he called exhaustion, and some of his friends and even Coretta sometimes referred to as depression. He was going 90 miles an hour all the time, no rest. He had to speak almost constantly to raise money for the SCLC. He was jumping from one fire to another, and he had his own government, breathing down his neck. And sometimes the only way he could escape it was to go into the hospital. So he took sleeping pills, as he often did, one night in the hospital. Woke up the next morning to a phone call from Coretta saying, "You've won the Nobel Peace Prize." And he honestly, literally did not know if he was still asleep and dreaming this. And, again, remarkably, to King's credit, he invited the press to come to the hospital and gave his first press conference in his hospital bed. And when asked why he was in the hospital, he said, "I'm just here for maintenance." They didn't have the vocabulary at that point, or the society wasn't really ready to discuss mental health issues. But the other extraordinary thing about that moment is that it really comes at a time when King is beginning to recognize the scope of his work, and that he doesn't have to confine himself to fighting segregation in the South. And the Nobel Prize is kind of a validation of that. He begins to speak out, and Coretta, to her credit, is encouraging him, saying that we have a greater responsibility than ever now. And it's at that moment that King begins to think more seriously about attacking racism in the North, fighting segregation in places where people are not acknowledging it quite so openly, and talking about international issues. He begins talking about apartheid and about war in other countries. So I think it's a moment where he realizes that he has a greater responsibility than ever.
Yeah, and that leads right into one of my favorite speeches of King's that you write about, was his speech at Riverside Church in 1967. What was significant about that speech?
Well, his advisors, once again, were telling him, don't do it. They were saying, they told him, don't go north, don't go to Chicago, stick with what you're good at, stay focused on voting rights in the South. And we know we're effective there. We can raise money in the North, and we can eventually tip the balance of power, get enough Black people registered to vote in the South, we'll win more offices, we'll win Congress, we'll make a big difference that way. But King's morality, his conscience wouldn't let him do that, and his religion, I should say, wouldn't let him do that. And he began to realize that if he was going to call out violence in the South, if he was going to call out police brutality in Los Angeles, he had to call out the war in Vietnam too. And it's that speech at Riverside Church, April 4th, 1967, that he says, "America is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth." And the Vietnam War is just one example of how we have lost our way morally as a society. It is corrupting our soul. The war itself is changing our hearts and minds. It's changing who we are as a people. That it's not just that we're killing and that we're losing our own citizens at this war, but the fact that we would accept this war is changing our moral equation, more of the balance of this country. And he really sums up his entire belief as a Christian in that speech. And I think it's probably my favorite of all of King's speeches. And the sad thing is that when it's over, he's bashed almost universally. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they all say it was a disaster, that he doesn't know what he's talking about, that he's not qualified to speak on these issues, and that he's a traitor. And even one of his closest friends and advisors calls him the next day and says, "I didn't like that speech. It didn't sound like you, and it's going to cost us politically." And King says, again, to one of his best friends and closest advisors, "Don't you understand? Don't you even know who I am? It might not have been politically wise, but it was not morally unwise." And it's just heartbreaking to think that he still has to explain himself.
Yeah, and you paint such an intimate portrait of King. How much did his family members collaborate with you on your work, on your research?
Not as much as I would have liked. I was in good contact with a lot of his friends and some of his closest friends, and including people like Andrew Young and Juanita Abernathy, Harry Belafonte, and some of King's nieces and nephews gave me interviews that really helped me understand the family's history. But the King children decided not to participate in the book, which I was disappointed by.
What was Harry Belafonte like to work with?
Oh my God, I love that man. I spent 3 hours at his home the first time I interviewed him, and he was just as warm as could be. And at one point, he was showing me some of his memorabilia. He had on the wall a draft of King's first Vietnam speech that he gave in Los Angeles. And I asked him, do you mind if I take a picture of it so I can see how the handwritten draft, because Belafonte said that he fished it out of the garbage, that King had written that draft in his apartment, in Belafonte's apartment. And then when King left, he went to see if there's anything in the garbage because, he was curious what King was doing, and he saved that. So I said, can I take a picture of it and compare it to the actual speech that he presented? And Belafonte said, sure, just take it down off the wall and bring it over by the window. And I said, I'm not touching that thing. It's probably worth $1 million. And he was 90 years old at the time, and he got up and said, come on. And he took one side of it and I took the other, and we moved it off the window. And when we were getting done, I said, you probably hear this all the time, but my mom is 80 and she still has a huge crush on you. And he said, what's your mom's name? I said, her name's Phyllis. And he took out a piece of paper and wrote a note to my mom.
Oh my gosh. And
so
then
he was a prince. Absolutely a prince.
Now, in the final pages of the book, you write, by hallowing King, we have hallowed him. What do you mean by that?
I am all in favor of celebrating King. In my opinion, he's the greatest American, period. But by hallowing him, by treating him as a saint, we make him unreachable in a way. We can't expect people to try to walk in his shoes, to aspire to do the things he did, if we turn him into a two-dimensional character, if we water down his message, if we only teach I have a dream, if we ignore his flaws. I think he is more inspiring when he's human, when he's approachable, when we can imagine that we don't have to be perfect to try our best to live up to our beliefs. And I think that for a long time, it's almost like an unintended side effect of the national holiday. And I certainly would have voted for the national holiday. I would vote for it again, but it had the unintended side effect of watering down his message. We teach I have a dream to kids in kindergarten, and we don't get much more sophisticated than that. At the monument in Washington, D.C., they don't sell his books. Well, they didn't sell his books until I started complaining about it. And I wrote in my book that they should sell his books, that we need to hear his words. We need more than the watered down version. So I just got an email last week saying that they're now stocking his books.
Nice.
Memorial gift shop. So if my book has accomplished nothing else, it has accomplished that.
Yes. And speaking of Coretta, she is throughout the book, and you really get a sense of sort of how much she was working behind the scenes, but it seemed as if she really yearned to be a part of the movement. Why didn't sort of King, embrace her doing more leadership roles?
Well, he was a sexist, to be blunt. And it's sad and it's ironic, because the thing that I think made Martin Luther King fall in love with Coretta Scott was her activism. King was a player. He had a lot of girls. And when he met Coretta, he was dating several women at the same time. Why did he tell Coretta on the first date, you're the one I've been looking for? I think it's because she had activist experience more than he did. He really hadn't done anything at that point, but she had been involved in all kinds of protests at Antioch College. She'd been to the Progressive Party National Convention. I think he was really hot for that. And yet he rejected her as a partner when it came to the civil rights movement, and told her he expected her to stay home and raise the kids, that was the woman's responsibility. And it wasn't just Coretta. He overlooked the potential contributions of people like Ella Baker, who should have been the executive director, not just the acting, briefly installed executive director of the SCLC. He overlooked Septa McClark. He overlooked even Dorothy Cotton, who was, one of his closest friends and partners in romance, but he overlooked her contributions as a leader. And that's just, some of it comes from being a Baptist preacher. Some of it comes from being born in 1929, but some of it, you just have to say, he missed the ball. He missed a great opportunity.
And what was he like as a father?
He was absent a lot, but wonderful when he was home. I think his kids adored him when he came in the door, and he was playful and attentive. But he was gone probably 90% of the days. He probably spent, if he spent 1 in 10 days at home in Atlanta with the family, that was probably a good, it was no more than that. So it was tough. I think it was really hard on the kids.
Yeah, and one big mystery you write about is that blue suitcase of letters that between Coretta and Martin Luther King, about where that is. Have you found any conclusion about where that suitcase of letters might be?
I suspect, let me give our listeners some context. Coretta's secretary told me that she kept all the personal letters under her bed in a blue Samsonite suitcase. And I mentioned that in the book in the hopes that someday somebody would tell me they found the suitcase. I suspect one of the children has it right now. And it's interesting, when the King papers were archived and Stanford University began publishing volumes of the King papers. They've only published 7 volumes. I think they've got at least 6 volumes to go. Coretta called and complained to Clay Carson, who was running the project, and saying, why aren't there any more personal letters in there? Why aren't there any of my letters in there? And Carson said, well, because you didn't give us any. So Coretta then released 1 or 2. But I suspect there are a lot more. And when those come out, I'm going to have to, revise if they ever become public, I'm going to have to write a new edition of the book.
Absolutely, the paperback addendum.
Yes.
Now, before I pass you over to Ryan, what do you hope readers take away when they finish this work? What new insights about King maybe do you hope that readers garner?
Well, I hope that people will see that King was the rare individual who never wavered from trying to do what he believed. It was so many opportunities. He had so many opportunities to back off, to say, okay, well, I've done enough. I'm going to take it easy now. I've risked my life. I've been stabbed in the chest. My home has been bombed. The windows of my house have been shot at, and I seem to be getting nothing but abuse for it. I'm going to hand off the baton. I'm going to go write a book. I'm going to go teach. I'm going to, he never did. And it's because he believed as a Christian that he had an obligation to work to make the world whole, to help us live up to the images, to the teachings of, in his case, Jesus. And that is so rare. And it's so inspiring to me today that every time in fact, he doubled down as he became more famous and more powerful. He felt like, well, now I have to expand. I have to embrace all of what's important to me. I have to fight for everything. So by the last year of his life, as his popularity was falling, and the vast majority of Americans disapproved of him, he said, well, I can't just fight for civil rights anymore. I have to fight for human rights. I have to attack hunger and poverty and war. And he was planning this poor people's campaign that was basically like Occupy Washington, D.C. So I hope people realize just how true he was to his ideals, how courageous he was, but also that he suffered for that, and that it wasn't easy, that he endured great pain along the way. I hope people will see him as more human when they read this book, but also more inspiring.
Absolutely. And we have a number of high school teachers, students in our audience. And I think, too, your book is so inspiring in that it helps us look at our heroes and find so many other layers that maybe haven't been discovered with them.
Thank you.
A beautiful way. And now I'm going to pass things over to Ryan, who's going to have our student question of the week.
Yes, thank you so much, Gina, for that wonderful back and forth, and looking forward to this portion of the program, which many of our loyal listeners and watchers know always begins with our student scholar question of the week. And this is a weekly competition in which students have a chance to ask our guests a question for a chance for themselves and their teacher to win a $50 gift card to the Gilder Lehrman gift shop. And this week, our question is from John, who attends Stuyvesant High School. And he asks if you could talk a little bit about maybe the biggest misconception regarding Dr. King's either life, career, or both.
Wow, the biggest misconception. I think in particular today, there's a misconception that he was more conservative than a lot of other Black leaders. And we even see some politicians, I won't call out any names, arguing that King was conservative on issues of race, that he believed that because he said in his "I Have a Dream" speech that we should be judged by the content of our character, not by the color of our skin. Some people have tried to argue that he would be opposed to affirmative action, and that's, you see that a lot. Almost every time there's a controversy around affirmative action. And I think King was very clear that he supported affirmative action. When he went to India and learned about the very aggressive programs that were underway to try to help the untouchables, at first he said, wow, is that legal? Can you give preference in programs and in job searches to, in education, to these people just because of their status, just because of their class? And he asked questions about it, but he became convinced and wrote frequently that we had to pay a price to those who have been denied equal rights until they attain equity. And he talked about how a lot of people say all Black people, all Americans in general, should be required to lift themselves up by their bootstraps, but that's an insult to people who haven't been given any boots. So I think one of the big misconceptions is that King was more conservative, and we often see him put in juxtaposition with Malcolm X as the conservative and the radical. And I would argue that Martin Luther King was more radical than Malcolm X. And it would be a great debate subject, because who's more radical, the person who issues the most fiery demagogic, the most fiery oratory, or the person who actually challenges the system and forces the most change? Martin Luther King forced far more change on American society than Malcolm X ever did. So that's just my opinion. That's the side I would take in that debate.
Fascinating, and a perfect idea for our high school civics teachers listening right now for that debate. Patrick says that I watched King in the Wilderness when his dream became a nightmare, a documentary film about the criticism King faced from the Democratic Party and civil rights leaders in the last 3 years of his life, arising from his opposition to the Vietnam War and Poor People's Campaign and calls for economic reforms, etc., as well as criticism from the Black Power movement. Does your book focus on the trauma that Dr. King faced specifically in the last few years of his life?
Yes, my book spends a lot of time on that. And I'm glad you pointed out the trauma, because it is worth noting that this was not just a politician like falling in the polls. He suffered for this. He suffered emotionally. His friends in the last couple of years of his life are deeply worried about his emotional state. At one point, they even have an intervention and discuss with him the possibility of going on some medication for depression, and he won't do it because he's afraid of what that would do to his reputation if the FBI leaked that. So he's under a constant attack, and he's doing a lot of the criticism that's coming at him is because he is standing up for what he believes in, because he's attacking racism in the North. He goes to Chicago and calls out substandard housing. He goes to Chicago and talks about segregated schools, and he gets beat up in the press for this. The white Northern media loves him when he's fighting Bull Connor, but when he takes on Mayor Daley in Chicago, it's another story. So King is constantly being harassed. And then he's got, as your questioners, hinted at, he's got people like Stokely Carmichael, the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, all criticizing him, calling him DeLorde, as if he's like some old, ancient preacher on high who's out of touch with the people. And that was just, not fair and hurtful to King.
Thank you so much for that wonderful question and response. Kimberly says, thank you so much for writing such an authentic biography of King. Did you have any apprehensions about writing about Dr. King? If so, what were they? And secondly, how did you work through those apprehensions to finish this book? If you did have any, yeah.
I have apprehensions about everything I do. The act of biography is an act of hubris, and to take on another person's life story is, almost an absurd proposition. We cannot know our own life stories. If I were to write my own story or my wife's story or my father's story, I could not really do it adequate justice. But we do our best, and we do it with humility. And in the case of King, I felt a special apprehension and humility because he's a titanic figure. He's a saint to many people. He's also Black and Christian, and I'm white and Jewish. So I felt an extra measure of humility was in order. And I approached it first, by asking the people closest to King if they would help me and if they would talk to me and help me understand King better. And then I began talking to scholars in the field and asking them if they felt like this was a worthwhile project and if they would help me and read chapters along the way. More than any book I've ever written, I had a committee, more than a committee. I had like a stadium full of people reading behind me and backing me up and giving me advice, criticisms, suggestions, so that I would feel like I had, obviously you can't have too many voices in your head and you can't listen to everybody. It's my judgment in the end about what goes in the book and what doesn't. But it was very helpful to have some experts in the field and people who knew King reading and giving me some advice so that I could overcome that's how I overcame some of my apprehension.
Wonderful, thank you. Malik asks if you could comment on what you think Dr. King's response would be to some current apprehension or rather diluting, if we will, of education and history and particularly of African American history. If you could comment, I think that we might be able to suspect how he would feel, but if you could talk a little bit about how you think he would react to some of that.
I find when I'm asked, what would Dr. King say, I never have to speculate because he said it. His books are so rich, and certainly his sermons. He gave hundreds, probably thousands of sermons in his career, and the answers are all there. And he said we have to understand history to understand where we are today, and certainly we have to understand Black history to understand where we are today. He talked about the fact that Black people came here in bondage and learned about Christianity throughout enslavement and found a way to take that and turn it into a force for good, found a way to believe that this country could be made whole and that they might be the people who lead America toward fulfilling the promise of democracy. If you don't embrace that part of the history, you can't possibly understand where you are. I would suggest that if you're not embracing that part of our history, you don't want to know where we really are today. You are just trying to remain in your little silo and tune out the reality. And I think King said it over and over again that, and he said it in the March on Washington speech, we love to quote, I have a dream and that, let freedom ring. But we forget that in the first half of that speech, he said that America had defaulted on its promise and that it was time to pay. And he talked about slavery in that speech, and that's the context, that's the foundation of the entire speech, see, the foundation of his dream.
Yes, absolutely. Paul asks if writing about Martin Luther King was a different kind of process experience than writing about some famous sports figures that you've written about in the past. Is there any similarities? Do you approach it the same, or are there any differences between King and an athlete?
Well, there are a lot of differences. Athletes don't tend to write as much. Not saying all of them, but in general, there's not as much written material to work with. And also, even Ali was a very spiritual man, but he was not a theologian. So King's religious beliefs, required a lot more research for me and a lot more, I think it was a lot more to be reckoned with. And I think that the book required just a different level of spirituality, even for me as the writer, to embrace and to try to understand how much King was guided by the words that he absorbed from the Bible and from his father as a preacher and his grandfather as a preacher. I think that this book to me felt like a much more spiritual journey than any of my others.
Fascinating, thank you. We have a question about from let me just see if I could pull it up here. I just had it. Oh, I'm sorry, from Howard, who mentions that Dr. King joined the Alpha Phi Alpha. Hopefully my Greek is correct, fraternity during his college years, and he's just wondering if this experience or maybe his undergraduate career in general had any long-lasting influence on him and into adulthood.
Yeah, I hope I don't upset any Alpha Phi Alphas, but because I know that's an important part of King's identity, but he did not join as an undergraduate. He joined later. And his undergraduate years, he lived at home with his parents. And remember, he entered Morehouse at age 16 and graduated I think 19 maybe. And so he was much younger than most of his classmates, and he was living at home. So he did not have quite as active a social life on campus as a lot of undergraduates, and a lot of Morehouse kids at that point were commuters. But he certainly had an active social life when he left home and went to seminary and then to Boston University. But so I don't really know how active he was as a member of that fraternity, because he did join after his undergraduate years.
Fascinating. Thank you. Leanne asks, was there anything that you learned about Dr. King in your research project that totally surprised you?
Oh, there were many things that I learned that totally surprised me. I got to meet some of King's old friends. I got to meet his barber, who, by the way, told me he didn't tip. King did not. King didn't tip. But I think I was just mostly thrilled to learn some of the little things that, he chewed his fingernails, that he named his dog Topsy, which was a character from Uncle Tom's Cabin, and just all those humanizing little details were really delightful to me. I'll throw one more little funny thing out there.
Please.
There was a book that was published 10, 15 years ago that said that King cheated at Monopoly when he was a kid. And I interviewed a woman who felt very badly that had been misunderstood, because she had played Monopoly and had said that King's brother had cheated. But she said ML, as she called him, would never cheat. His brother would try to get him to cheat, try to get him to collude. And ML, even at age 10 or 11, was too moral to cheat at Monopoly.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. William and a couple of other people in the Q&A box are asking about that you mentioned that Dr. King's children chose not to participate in this book, or offer assistance in any way. Do you suspect that it's because your book does focus on the humanness of Dr. King? And secondly, William asks, have you heard anything since the book has been published from family members? Any reaction?
I've been told that it was probably because I mentioned the affairs that he had, and that the family, really, the kids still don't believe that it's true, in spite of what I consider incontrovertible evidence. We have the transcripts of phone calls with King on the phone with these girlfriends, and people I know who knew King well have confirmed to me that in fact he was seeing some of these women. But I understand that, if it were my father, I might feel the same way, that I'm not prepared to cooperate with anybody who writes that about, who wants to dwell on that. And I didn't dwell on it. I think I kept it to a real minimum in the book. I wanted to be honest, but I certainly wasn't interested in spending any more time than necessary on that kind of a material. So I think that's probably why the kids were not comfortable participating with my book. I hope that they'll read it and give it a chance. I was with Andrew Young yesterday in Atlanta, and Andrew Young is probably the closest surviving friend of King's. King's children call him Uncle Andy. And he told me that he thought that I handled that material very well, very sensitively, very accurately, and that he intended to give copies of the book to King's children personally and suggest to them that he thought they should read the book. So I'm hoping that they might read it and at least we agree to disagree, but I hope maybe they'll appreciate some of the other things I did in the book.
Wonderful. Thank you for that question and answer. Clarence asked what I think is a really important question. As we mentioned, we have so many teachers and students currently on this call and that are within the Gilder Lehrman wide network. And Clarence says, hi, Jonathan. I teach 8th grade in Georgia Studies in Atlanta. I have limited time in the classroom. Is there a particular chapter or a way of teaching using this wonderful book to in the classroom to integrate? Is there a particular chapter or part that you might recommend for our teachers to use and integrate this book into their lesson planning?
That's a great question. I have an 8th grader and at home, and she hasn't read the book yet. But I think there are a couple of opportunities. I would love to see kids read the chapter about the I Have a Dream speech, and then the following chapter in which the FBI begins its surveillance of King. And that juxtaposition in the book it's intentional, but it's also just factual. The day after King gave his I Have a Dream speech, the FBI decided that King posed a threat to American society. I would love to, and I think 8th graders are right in the and certainly high school students as well, but I think eighth graders could handle a discussion about why some people in America, and not just American government, why would some people in American government see I Have a Dream speech as a threat to American society? We do a great job of teaching I Have a Dream to elementary school kids, and the principles of brotherhood and sisterhood and peace, nonviolence, but we need to take it a step further. We don't do a great job of teaching the complexity of the reaction to King's Dream, and I think that would be a great starting point. So those two chapters, I can't remember the chapter numbers, maybe 24 and 25 if I'm remembering correctly, but the dream chapter and the following chapter, I think would make a great lesson.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And sort of as a follow-up, we have a couple of questions in the chat that ask if you would ever consider working perhaps with somebody and to make this a young adult friendly. And if not, are there any young adult books or resources that you might recommend regarding Dr. King, if any come to mind?
I would love to do that. I think that, like I said, I think even eighth, ninth graders could handle this book, but for slightly younger, maybe for kids who are not quite ready for 600 pages, a smaller book would be appropriate. I think my friend Kwame Alexander is now working on a book for a King book for kids, but that might be slightly younger audience. I don't know, and I'm not sure, for that, middle age, middle grade, what's out there.
Fascinating. Thank you. I believe you mentioned this a little bit with Gina, but we have some other questions that if you could just about more specifically about just the process of writing this behemoth, wonderful book. What archives and primary sources did you really rely on that make up kind of the thrust of the book? Are there particular archives or again that were key to you? For you?
Yeah, well, I began with interviews, because as I mentioned, I recognized that there were people still alive who knew King and that they were getting up there in years. So I really spent the first year or two interviewing as many people as I could. And I was lucky to start before COVID so that I could interview them in person. And, famous people like Belafonte and John Lewis, but also friends from childhood, the barber, the organist at the church, that kind of thing. At the same time, while I'm doing that, I'm scouring archives. And the FBI released all these new documents, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, because when you begin looking around, and it's been 30, 40 years since the last King biography, you find that a lot of new materials have been donated to private collections. So probably the biggest and most important discovery that I made was that L.D. Reddick, who wrote the first book about King in 1957, and who had interviewed King and stayed with King throughout his career, went on to work as the official archivist for King's organization, the SCLC. He had just donated all of his papers, thousands and thousands of pages, to the Schomburg Library in Harlem, and the boxes had not yet been opened. I was the first person to ask to see those boxes. And that's the kind of thing that I get so excited about. It's like throwing, raw meat to the lions. I found many, that was probably the biggest collection that I discovered, but I found Daddy King's unpublished autobiography. I found tapes that Coretta made working on her memoir that I don't think anyone else had listened to. Hosea Williams' private papers I discovered that hadn't been accessed yet. So lots of really fun discoveries. And that's why the book took 6 years, because I'm just, going through all of these papers. Oh, and LBJ's secretary had kept the most sensitive papers of all from the president's office in her files so that they wouldn't be mixed in with the presidential files. And I was the first person to see many of those too.
Fascinating. And the quick follow-up, is there anything that you wish you could have gotten your hands on that you didn't have a chance to, or any, just omissions that didn't make the book, or anything like that?
Well, there's the blue suitcase that we mentioned
Of course,
earlier.
yes.
That's a big one. And then, I keep talking about the FBI transcripts. Those are transcripts of tapes, and we don't have the tapes yet. They are scheduled to be released in 2027, and it will be interesting to see what else is on the tapes that didn't make it into the transcript. It will be interesting to see if everything described by the FBI is accurate when we listen to those tapes, how much of it is exaggerated, how much of it is embellished. So that's probably the other big thing that's still hanging out there.
Fascinating. David says that he can't help his students from being interested in asking questions about the assassination. And he's just wondering if you dedicate any space in your book to the assassination or Martin Luther King's death. Is that present in your book? And if you could talk a little bit about that.
I spend a fair bit of time on the assassination, but not really the conspiracy theories. And I'll tell you why. I did not see anything new to suggest that there might have been a conspiracy that I know a lot of the family members, King's children, still believe that James Earl Ray did not pull the trigger and that there was a vast conspiracy in their opinions. And I respect their opinions on that, but I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that that was the case. But I think what's more important to note is that the FBI knowingly and intentionally created the conditions in which someone might want to assassinate Martin Luther King. And in fact, just a couple of months before the assassination, sent a memo to every bureau office saying that Malcolm X is dead. All the other Black leaders are really marginal. Martin Luther King is the man best positioned to become the Black Messiah who leads an uprising. And we must do everything in our power to subvert him, to undermine him. And it's not impossible to imagine that some FBI offices would interpret that as, certainly it's not saying, let's protect this guy. I think they're creating an environment in which some American might think it's a good idea to take this guy out. And I think that is the real scandal.
Fascinating. Thank you. And just keeping an eye on time, perhaps a good final question before throwing it back to Gina for some final thoughts would be, oftentimes readers look to autobiographies for traits that they could kind of take into their own lives, notable and positive traits. What were Dr. King's, best traits? Was it his work ethic or otherwise that we could, kind of use as a model in our own lives as readers?
I think King is so inspiring in so many ways because he's constantly trying to improve himself. He's constantly challenging, even what his father wants him to do. His father doesn't want him to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. His father keeps telling him it's too dangerous. He stands up for what he believes in. He stands up not only to his father, but he stands up to the president. King doesn't like conflict. This is one of the things that really fascinates me about him. He's having to fight his basic instinct, which is to go along and get along. He wants everybody to like him. But he knows what's important and he's willing to stand up for what he believes in, and he's willing to risk his life for what he believes in. And to me, that's, still so inspiring that he's constantly trying to improve himself. He's trying, whenever he finds success, whenever he accomplishes something, he's asking not like, okay, I'm done, or, he's, what can I do next? What can I do next that's even more challenging? He's always looking for the next big challenge, and I'm really moved by that.
Fascinating. Thank you. And thank you so much for this portion of the program. I'm going to throw it back to Gina for some final thoughts. And I'm so sorry if I didn't get to your question, but a great remedy for that is buying this tremendous and wonderful book. And there's links in the chat to do so. So we urge our listeners to buy the book. And thank you so much. Gina, back to you.
Yes, and as Ryan mentioned, if you get it through bookshop.org, the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for history teachers and students. And next week, we're thrilled to welcome Glory Liu and her book, Adam Smith's America, How a Scottish Philosopher Became an Icon of American Capitalism. And we invite you to watch our archive of more than 150 scholar presentations on book breaks at gilderlerman.org/bookbreaks. And you can also go to our website for documents, essays, digital exhibitions, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. Jonathan, thank you so much for this amazing hour. This has truly been a fantastic program today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Right. And again, encourage everyone to get a copy of King Alive and have a great day.